The first snow fell early that year, November 12, 1944. Auschwitz-Birkenau, occupied Poland. White flakes drifted down onto the mud between barracks, onto the electrified fences, onto the train tracks where cattle cars still arrived daily. I watched the snow through the window of the musicians' quarters as I rose in my bow. Outside, guards shouted commands, dogs barked, a new transport had arrived. Soon we would be called to play. My hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the knowledge of what my music would accompany. I closed my eyes and tried to remember who I had been before this place, before my violin became an instrument of death rather than life. I was David Rosenberg, 31 years old, former first violinist with the Warsaw Philharmonic Orchestra. Before the war, I had performed Mendelssohn and Mahler in concert halls across Poland. I had taught at the conservatory. I had lived in an apartment filled with books and sheet music, with my wife Rebecca and our daughter Hannah. 3 years earlier, they had been taken to Treblinka. I had been sent to Auschwitz because when the SS officer asked if anyone had special skills, I had raised my hand and said, "I play violin." Those 4 words had kept me alive when most others died. Those 4 words were both my salvation and my prison. The camp maintained an orchestra of prisoners, Jews and other inmates with musical training. We played at various official functions, during Sunday concerts for the SS officers and their families, and most terribly, during selections and marches to the gas chambers. Our conductor, another prisoner, had once led the Berlin Opera. Our cellist had played with the Vienna Symphony. Our clarinetist had been a klezmer musician from Krakow. We were kept marginally better fed than other prisoners, given slightly warmer clothing, housed in separate quarters. These privileges, if such things could be called privileges in this place, came at a cost none of us had imagined when we first identified ourselves as musicians. When I arrived at Auschwitz in 1942, the orchestra had already been established. The camp commandant, an SS officer named Müller, fancied himself a music lover. Bach was his favorite. "Music elevates even this place," he told me during my audition, as if the death camp were merely an unfortunate setting for cultural appreciation rather than a factory of murder. I played Bach's Chaconne for him that day, my fingers remembering what my mind wanted to forget, muscle memory carrying me through the piece despite my emaciated state. Muller nodded in approval. "You'll do," he said. "Report to the orchestra leader." Just like that, I was spared the selection process that sent most new arrivals directly to the gas chambers. The orchestra's duties were explained to me by Jakob, a violist from Prague who had been in Auschwitz since 1941. "We play when they tell us to play," he said simply. "Marches when new transports arrive. Classical pieces for Sunday concerts, whatever they ask for." He paused, his eyes focused on something distant. "And we play by the path to the crematoria. We play while they walk to their deaths." The matter-of-fact way he said this, stripped of emotion, of judgment, was my first introduction to how one survived here. You separated yourself from what you witnessed. You performed your function. You did not think too deeply about your role in the machinery of this place. But I did think about it. I thought about it every time we assembled near the selection platform as a train arrived. We would play marches. Strauss was a favorite of the guards, as people descended from the cattle cars, dazed and disoriented after days of travel without food or water, without sanitation, often with the dead among them. We played as the SS officers divided the new arrivals with casual gestures, right for work, left for immediate death. We played as families were separated, as mothers were torn from children, as the elderly and infirm were identified for extinction. Most terrible were the times we played along the path to the gas chambers. The victims were told they were going to showers, to delousing. Some believed this, others knew better, but walked with dignity because there was no alternative. Our orchestra, positioned along the route, played Schubert, Mozart, folk tunes, the soundtrack to mass murder. I watched their faces as they passed. Some ignored us. Some looked confused by the presence of music in this place of horror. Some, especially the older ones who recognized the classical pieces, seemed momentarily comforted, a familiar sound in an incomprehensible situation. It was this comfort that haunted me most, the cruel deception that music, that art itself, had become in Auschwitz. At night, in the relative privacy of the musicians' quarters, I kept a diary. This was strictly forbidden. Possession of writing materials unauthorized for official work could mean death. But one of the administrative clerks, a Polish political prisoner named Piotr, smuggled me small pieces of paper and pencil stubs. I wrote in tiny script, hiding the pages inside the lining of my violin case. I wrote about the music we played and for whom we played it. I recorded names when I could learn them, descriptions when I couldn't. I documented what I saw, not the broad horror that was everywhere, but the specific moments of humanity that the Nazi machine tried to erase. I wrote about the elderly man with a professor's bearing who hummed along to our Mozart as he walked toward the gas chamber, conducting with his finger as if appreciating a concert. About the young mother who danced her toddler to our waltz, the child's delighted laughter echoing obscenely against the crematorium walls. About the teenage girl who stopped before me, recognized the Mendelssohn I was playing, and whispered, "I studied this piece," before a guard shoved her forward. Small moments of individual existence in a place designed to convert humans into ash and smoke. In December 1943, a transport arrived from France. Among the new prisoners was Michel, a violinist from the Paris Conservatory. When he was assigned to the orchestra, I felt both relief at having another skilled player and shame at welcoming anyone into our terrible role. He was younger than me, barely 25, with quick eyes that observed everything. After his first performance along the path to the gas chambers, he returned to our quarters and vomited until there was nothing left in him but bile. "How do you do it?" he asked me later that night, his voice so low it was almost inaudible. "How do you play for them while knowing where they're going?" I had no good answer. "I play for them, not for the SS," I finally said. "I play to say, someone sees you, someone bears witness, someone remembers." Michel nodded slowly. "Then I will do the same." He became my closest friend in that place where friendship was both dangerous and essential. We shared the small extra rations we sometimes received after performing for officers. We covered for each other when illness made one of us unable to play at full capacity. And I showed him my diary, the pages of testimony hidden in my violin case. "This is resistance," he said after reading my entries. "They want no record of their victims as individuals. Your writing gives them back their humanity." From then on, he helped me gather names and details, expanding my chronicle of those who passed before us on their way to death. The most difficult performances were for the Jewish holidays. The SS officers took particular pleasure in forcing us to play klezmer music, traditional Jewish wedding songs, on Rosh Hashanah or Passover as Jews walked to the gas chambers. This desecration of cultural memory, using our own music as a weapon against our people, felt like a violation beyond the physical horrors of the camp. During one such performance on Yom Kippur in 1944, I made a decision. I would play, as ordered, but I would transform the music into a silent act of defiance. As a line of Hungarian Jews approached, I began the folk tune the SS had requested. But beneath the expected melody, I wove in fragments of Kol Nidre, the sacred Yom Kippur prayer. It was subtle, a few phrases integrated into the louder folk song, audible primarily to those who would recognize it. I saw the change in some faces as they passed, a flicker of recognition, sometimes a slight nod, occasionally tears. I locked eyes with an old man who mouthed the words of the prayer as he heard my violin voice it. For a moment, we were not prisoner and victim, but two Jews remembering who we were beyond this place. The guards noticed nothing, but some of those walking to their deaths heard the true music beneath the false. From that day forward, I found small ways to reclaim the music that had been corrupted by its context. When forced to play Wagner, Hitler's favorite composer, I would subtly incorporate phrases from Mendelssohn, a Jewish composer whose music had been banned in Germany. When playing marches for the SS, I would introduce almost imperceptible dissonances, tiny fractures in the martial perfection they demanded. These musical acts of resistance were meaningless in practical terms. They saved no lives, stopped no suffering, but they preserved something in me that Auschwitz was designed to destroy, the insistence that even here I remained human, with the human capacity for choice. Have you ever been forced to use your talents in ways that betrayed what you believed? Have you ever survived by participating in something that wounded your soul? Have you found small spaces for resistance when open defiance would mean destruction? Share your experience in the comments. I need to know that others understand this impossible position between survival and complicity. The winter of 1944-1945 was brutal. Coal was scarce, food scarcer. The Nazi war effort was failing, and conditions in the camp deteriorated as resources were diverted to the collapsing fronts. Several orchestra members died of disease or were killed when they became too weak to play adequately. We performed with numb fingers, our breath visible in the freezing air. Yet the machinery of death continued operating. Trainloads still arrived, selections still occurred, the crematoria still belched smoke into the gray sky. Michel fell ill in January, racked with fever from typhus. I shared my rations with him, tried to cool his forehead with snow smuggled from outside. For 3 days I played his parts as well as mine, covering his absence with the explanation that he had injured his hand. On the 4th day, an SS guard came to check on him and found him delirious with fever. Useless, the guard pronounced, and ordered him taken to the camp hospital, which we all knew was merely a way station to the gas chambers for those too sick to work. Before they took Michel away, he pressed something into my hand, a small cross on a chain. "From my mother," he whispered, "not my faith, but hers. Keep it. Survive." I hid the cross in my violin case alongside my diary pages. He was gone before nightfall. I never learned exactly how he died, whether from the illness itself or by a doctor's lethal injection, the common fate of the seriously ill. In my diary that night, I wrote his full name, Mikkel Bergman, and everything I knew about him. His love of Debussy, his fiancée waiting in Lyon, the small café his parents had run before the war, the way he could mimic bird calls on his violin. In the first days of 1945, the sounds of artillery could be heard in the distance, the Soviet army approaching from the east. The SS began preparations to evacuate the camp and destroy evidence of what had happened there. Crematoria were dynamited, mass graves were exhumed and bodies burned, documents were destroyed. The machinery of death was dismantled even as it continued to operate. New orders came for the orchestra. We were to play only German military marches and Nazi anthems. The pretense of cultural appreciation was abandoned as the Reich collapsed into its essential brutality. On January 18th, the evacuation began in earnest. Most prisoners were forced on death marches westward, away from the advancing Soviets. Thousands would die of exposure, exhaustion, or execution along those snow-covered roads. The orchestra was ordered to assemble one last time. We expected to be marched out with the others. Instead, Commandant Müller addressed us directly. "You have served your purpose," he said flatly. "The Reich no longer requires your music." In that moment, I understood we were to be executed, witnesses eliminated before the Russians arrived. But then artillery boomed closer than before, and a messenger arrived with urgent news. After a brief consultation, Müller ordered the guards to include us in the next evacuation column instead. Once again, circumstance had postponed my death. As we prepared to leave, I faced an impossible choice. My violin and its case, with my diary hidden inside, had become my identity in Auschwitz. But on the march, carrying anything beyond minimal essentials would be nearly impossible. Many prisoners were already discarding possessions they couldn't carry. I knew the diary was evidence, perhaps the only record of those specific lives I had witnessed in their final moments. I could not take the violin, but I could not leave the testimony behind. In desperation, I sought out Piotr, the clerk who had provided my writing materials. He worked in the administrative building where some Polish staff would remain until the final evacuation. "Keep this," I said, pressing the disassembled diary pages into his hands. "If you survive, make sure someone sees it." He nodded once, understanding the importance of what I was entrusting to him. I kept only Michel's cross concealed in the hem of my jacket and my rosin, small enough to hide in my pocket. I left my violin on my bunk, the instrument of my survival and my shame, abandoned to whatever fate awaited it. The death march was as horrific as we had feared. Columns of skeletal prisoners trudging through snow, anyone who fell behind, shot immediately. No food for days, no shelter. Hundreds died along the way. I survived by focusing on placing one foot before another, by remembering musical scores in my head to maintain sanity, by clutching Michel's cross in my pocket and promising his memory that I would live to speak of what we had witnessed. After nearly 2 weeks of marching, we reached Gross Rosenkamp, only to be evacuated again as Soviet forces continued their advance. Eventually, those of us still alive were brought to Buchenwald. There, in April 1945, American forces liberated the camp. I weighed 86 pounds. I had not touched a violin in 3 months. The music in my head had gone silent. Recovery was slow. Physical healing preceded emotional healing by months, even years. I was sent to a displaced persons camp, then to relatives in America who had escaped before the war. I found work teaching music in New York, though it was nearly a year before I could bring myself to play violin again. When I finally did, I wept through the entire first hour, purging something poisoned from my relationship with music. In 1952, I received a package from Poland. Inside was a water-damaged bundle of paper scraps, my diary, somehow salvaged and returned to me. A brief note explained that Piotr had survived and had kept his promise to preserve my testimony. The pages were fragile, the pencil faded, but the words remained legible. Names, descriptions, moments I had forced myself to record even as I participated in the machinery of their deaths. Evidence. I spent the next decade transcribing and expanding these notes into a complete manuscript. When it was finished, I contacted Holocaust documentation centers, shared my testimony with researchers, spoke at universities and community centers. I played violin again, professional chamber music, teaching, occasional solo performances, but always with the awareness that music had been both my savior and my curse in Auschwitz. Every time I performed, I remembered those for whom I had played on their way to the gas chambers. In 1963, I was called to testify at the trial of several former Auschwitz SS officers. I brought my diary and my violin. At the prosecutor's request, I played the Kol Nieder passage I had woven into the folk tunes, my small act of resistance made public at last. I named those I had seen walk to their deaths. I described the orchestra's role in maintaining the illusion of normalcy as thousands were murdered daily. I spoke of Michel and others who did not survive to tell their stories. One defendant, a former guard, claimed not to remember the orchestra or its function. There was so much noise in the camp, he said dismissively. Why would we want music there? His denial was another erasure, another attempt to silence the witnesses. In response, I played a Mendelssohn passage, one of those forbidden by the Reich, in the courtroom. Because even as you killed us, I said when I finished, you wanted to believe you were civilized men who appreciated beauty. The music allowed you that illusion. I am old now. My hands can no longer manage the intricate fingering of the violin pieces I once played. The generation that survived the Holocaust is dwindling. Soon, no living witnesses will remain. But testimony endures. My diary, now preserved in the Holocaust Museum, ensures that some of those who walked past me on their way to death are remembered not just as numbers, but as individuals who recognized Mozart, who hummed along with folk tunes, who whispered the words to Kol Nieder, who danced children in their arms during their final moments. The guilt of survival never fully leaves. The knowledge that my talent was used to ease others' path to destruction remains a weight I cannot set down. Yet I have come to understand that I was both victim and witness, coerced into participation, but choosing to bear testimony through my hidden diary, through my subtle musical rebellions, through my post-war life dedicated to remembrance. Music was corrupted in Auschwitz, twisted into a tool of deception and psychological torture. But music itself was not the perpetrator. The men who exploited it were. After decades of playing violin, of teaching new generations, of bearing witness, I have reclaimed what was taken from me in that place. The snow falls outside my window as I write these words. It reminds me of that other snow falling on Auschwitz in November 1944. But now it is just weather, not a backdrop to atrocity. The music in my head plays on, no longer accompanying death, but affirming life. This, too, is part of survival, finding a way to separate what was stolen and corrupted from what remains authentically ours. I play now for those who never left Auschwitz. I play the music they were denied in life, but that belongs to them in memory. Their final moments came with my forced melodies as accompaniment. Their remembrance deserves my freely given music as memorial. This is the price of peace I've learned to pay, to recognize that surviving can itself become a form of testimony, if we are brave enough to speak the full truth of what we did and what was done to us, refusing both demonization and false absolution. The truth is always more complex, more human, and ultimately more important than either extreme. And so I play, and so I remember, and so I ensure they are remembered, one note, one name, one life at a time.